Just realized y'all were muted online. Please use the Q&A instead of the chat for questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce Dr. Yun Zhou. Yun Zhou is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. Her research examines social inequality and state market family relations through the lens of gender, marriage, and reproduction. Intersecting the studies of population and politics, Zhou's current project investigates the demographic, political, and gender consequences of China's evolving reproductive governance. In addition to her academic publications, Zhou's research and commentary has been featured in BBC, The Guardian, New York Times, NPR, Reuters, and The Washington Post, among others. Zhou received her PhD in sociology from Harvard University in 2017. She completed her postdoctoral training at the Population Studies at Training Center, Brown University. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Yun Zhou for her presentation.
Thank you, June, for the kind introduction, and it's always great to be at Pop Centers. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am excited to share my research with you today. Today's talk comes from my ongoing book project that the overarching goal of the project is to intersect the studies of social demography with the studies of law and politics in trying to understand people's, especially women's, citizenship struggles through the vantage point of their family and fertility behavior. Today, I'm going to focus on gender, fertility and intentions, and visions of selfhood. Reproduction links the personal and the political across time and space, from Ceausescu's Romania, Deng Xiaoping's China, and the contemporary United States. We have seen people's, especially women's, reproductive behavior being the subject of the state's surveillance, design, and control. In the case of contemporary China, the decades-long one-child policy has garnered attention from both scholars and human rights activists alike. In 2016, a universal two-child policy went into effect, allowing all married couples in heterosexual marriages to have 2 children at most. And in 2021, that limit was again increased to 3 children per married heterosexual couples. Yet, despite these relaxations, in 2023, China, once the world's largest population, reported its first population decline since 1961, and that was 3 years into China's Great Leap Forward famine. So at the same time, using nationally representative survey data throughout the 2010s, I found a curious relationship between individuals' gender egalitarian views and their support for the state's restriction on birth. I found that Chinese individuals with more egalitarian gender attitudes, individuals who believe in women's equal rights, roles, and moral worth, actually show stronger support for the state's draconian restriction on birth. And why? And especially as China now joins the rank of other low fertility countries and simultaneously take on both an increasingly pro-natalist and an increasingly autocratic turn, the question becomes, how do individuals, through fertility ideation and behavior, come to comprehend their relation with the state? And I approach this overarching question from the theoretical vantage point of the pursuit of individualism. Theories of large-scale demographic transitions highlight the role of individualism, or a growing adherence to the role of individualism. And we see this in 2 of the most important and influential theories of demographic transitions. Drawing on a Maslowian framework, the second demographic transition theory argued that as individuals turn to higher order needs, family relations become secondary to the pursuit of self-actualization, thereby driving the retreat from marriage and the decline in fertility. Similarly, Arnold Thornton identified a system of beliefs that he called developmental idealism. Chief among them are the idea of autonomy, freedom, and individualism. And as the argument goes that as developmental idealism diffuses, we observe delayed marriage and smaller family size. However, in these theorizations of individualism and its link with demographic transitions, gender often remains a separate and sometimes overlooked dimension. The link between self-actualizing pursuit and the retreat from marriage and parenthood is often theorized as an agendered link, making no gender distinction between what higher order needs may mean for women and for men. And individualism is also understood as a broad cultural tenet, a cultural tenet that characterizes societies on a broad spectrum of modernity. Yet we know that decisions about marriage, decisions about parenthood are made by people embodying gendered bodies and with gendered lived experiences. So for today's talk, I want to take a more gender-forward perspective. And I ask, how do women and men make fertility decisions, attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct their visions of selfhood? And in so doing, I aim to bring two traditions of scholarship. On the one hand, the long-standing demographic research that theorizes and describes macro-level patterns and trends of family change. And on the other hand, the deep tradition in sociology that explores selfhood and identity. Drawing on in-depth interviews conducted after China's shift toward a universal two-child policy, I argue that through fertility decision-making, individuals enact gendered assertions of selfhood. Parenthood is viewed as the gendered means to achieve these visions of individualism. I will show that women view the transition into parenthood as the harbinger of the breaking of an individual self and the end of individual autonomy. Men, on the other hand, view this transition into parenthood as integral to the making of individual self, marking the beginning of an individual self that is fully legible to the broader society. And I argue that this sharp contrast has led some gender egalitarian women to see an autocratic state when limiting birth more as a friend than a foe. To arrive at this destination point, here is the road that we're going to travel together. I will first set the scene in describing gender and population dynamics and selfhood against the backdrop of the state and market dynamics of post-reform contemporary China. I will then briefly introduce my data and method, and then we'll turn to the empirical findings about the making and the breaking of self. And I conclude with some discussions of the theoretical implications of the findings. How do we imagine our future? And what does that imagination say about our present self? Cultural sociologists employ the concept of imagined future to study questions of identity and selfhood. Imagined future gives a design of a self to which we aspire, and it is understood as a key component of a person's sense of identity. And in this sense, we can understand individuals' fertility aspiration through this concept. And China is a particularly rich context to look into fertility aspiration and decision-making as the gendered construction of selfhood, as what individuals imagine as possible is deeply constrained by the state's population control policies over the past several decades. And at the same time, scholars have characterized gender and family relations in contemporary China as those of a profound paradox, entangling sometimes the confusing scripts of an autocratic state, a neoliberal market-centric development, and entrenched patriarchal familial norms. So what do I mean by that? After the tumultuous Cultural Revolution that ended in 1976, the Chinese party state turned to economic development as the new foundation of its political legitimacy. In this process, gender relations and population dynamics become two important pieces on the chessboard. China's post-reform labor and family policies envision or emphasize women's roles as mothers and caregivers. This is evident in the gender imbalance parental leave policies. Women in contemporary China enjoy long maternity leaves, whereas paternity leaves is very much subject to different provincial levels, ranging from 7 to 30 days, and largely in stark contrast to the minimum of 3 months of maternity leave that women enjoy. At the same time, the Chinese labor laws mandate a gender gap in retirement age. And that gender gap is based on the former Soviet policy that envisioned grandmothers as the necessary caregivers for their grandchildren. At the same time, protective laws exist that bars women from entry into certain occupations that are viewed as high risk or dangerous. At the same time, market reform also weakened the role of work units in providing public goods and services, such as dining services and childcare. So in that sense, care work was re-privatized as women's work, and women continue to shoulder the lion's share of unpaid domestic labor. Employers, rather than the state, now plays the key roles in allocating employment opportunities and deciding wage structure. And in recent years, protection against labor market gender discriminations remain weak. So as a result, despite closing and reversed gender gaps in higher educational attainment, scholars continue to find an enduring gender gap in employability for college graduates. And turning to reproduction, this is China's total fertility rate from 1960 to 2016 using World Bank's data. And as you can see, China's total fertility rate has already taken a nosedive all through the 1970s, from more than 6 to about 2.7, 2.8 at the end of the 1970s. Yet, despite fertility decline throughout the 1970s, the Chinese party state enacted the draconian one-child policy in 1980, limiting 1 child per married heterosexual couple, believing this limitation will eventually lead to a population size that is believed to be the most optimal for China's economic development. And in recent years, as China's TFR staged below replacement, the state did a 180 as the concern now becomes, will China grow old before it becomes rich? So we see multiple efforts in relaxing the one-child policy. Yet these efforts are similarly driven by concerns about China's shrinking labor pool, diminishing demographic dividend, and a possible economic stagnation. Throughout, population size becomes the way in which the state believes as a vehicle to achieve its developmental and political goals. And in these birth incentivizing measures, increasingly, especially in recent years, the emphasis are being placed on women's roles as nurturing mothers and good wives. So in this sense, against this backdrop, how do women and men make fertility decisions and attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct their visions of selfhood? Writ large, this is a question of existentially what it means to be autonomous, to be independent, and to lead a life of one's own in a context where the state holds considerable power over individuals. And to answer this question, I rely on original in-depth interview. And I must say that as a quantitatively trained researcher, turning to qualitative data for the first time was a tremendous learning opportunity, and it's a steep learning curve. But I landed on a qualitative approach because these qualitative data are particularly well equipped to uncover individuals' deeply held beliefs, ideations, and values. So I employ 115 original in-depth interviews that are conducted in 2 metropolitan areas between 2016 and 2017. And in recruitment, I draw a snowballing approach with strict sample selection criteria. This is to avoid a over-fragmentation of the final sample. And to qualify for the study, I included both men and women. And these are men and women who were born after China's market reform and have completed college education. So they were aged between 22 and 38. And all respondents identified as heterosexual, and they have all completed some form of college education. And you'll notice the star there because I have a rationale for focusing only on highly educated sample for this study, and I'm happy to talk more about it in Q&A. And for the partnered individuals in my sample, they are not in union with each other. And with such a qualitative approach, one of the concern is a possible network clustering of the final sample. So to alleviate some of those concerns, each of the seed in the referral chain was limited to give me at most 3 referrals. So for the final sample, I captured individuals across 3 life course stages. Those who have never been married, those who were in their first marriage but without children and have never given birth, and those who were in their first marriage and with exactly 1 biological child. So I ended with a final sample of 45 men and 70 women. Half of them are never married, whereas the other half are in their first marriages. And among those married individuals, about half of the women and half of the men and about a third of the women have their first child. And the interview protocol covers a range of questions about individuals' marriage ideations, fertility planning, and the work life in general. So we talked about their transition into marriage, we talked about their dating history, their marriage timing, and what are some of the obstacles and the preconditions that they believe need to be in place before they can get married. And similarly, we talked about the transition into childbearing. We talked about their ideal and intended timing of fertility. We talked about what they believe are the obstacles or preconditions that need to be met before they can have a first or, for some, a second child. We also talked about their work lives. So their job search experience, their workplace routine, and what are some of the work-family policies and the norms that are at their workplace. We also talked about their family lives. So what are their routines at home? What are their ideal and actual division of household labor and childcare? And whether they employ outsourcing for these unpaid domestic work. And in particular, I also adopted a set of the gender ideology items from the World Value Survey gender modules. So I read out each of the gender ideology item to my respondent, ask them, as you would in a survey, whether they strongly agree to strongly disagree with the statement. But in an interview setting, I was able to probe why they feel certain ways. And using these gender ideology items prompted my respondents to give deep and expanded reflections about their views on gender, and especially how they feel about the gender dynamics and gender relations in contemporary China. And finally, I also very specifically asked about their attitudes toward the one-child policy and its universal relaxation. So we now turn to findings. In presenting these findings, I'm going to give you illustrative quotes. And these are the quotes that most saliently captured the patterns and trends across interviews. So although it may just be one person, they're by no means a single occurrence. In fact, we reflect repeated trends and patterns that I've seen coming up from the data. So first, childbearing, the transition into childbearing as the breaking of individual self. Shanhu was at the time of the interview, Shanhu was a 31-year-old woman. She has been married for 4 years, and she was adamant that she really, really, really do not want to have a child. And when I asked why, she said, I don't really want children. I'm worried. Having children is going to be a large, completely transformative impact. I don't know if it's selfish, but I don't want to prioritize my own development. And Shanhu is by no means alone. And even among women who intend to have children or who are in the process of trying to conceive, we see a similar theme. Anling is a 31-year-old woman. She has been married for 2 years. And at the time of the interview, Anling was in the process of actively trying to have a child. So when it came to a surprise to me when I asked about her ideal fertility timing and why she was in the process, why does she feel like right now is a good time to have a child? It surprised me that Anling almost burst into tears. She said, I don't plan on being a dink, double income, no kids. So sooner or later, I have to have one. I'm really afraid though. So you ask me, what's the ideal time to have children? There's no ideal time. The ideal time is when I couldn't possibly delay anymore. Seeing how my female colleagues are after having children, I'm truly terrified. They changed so much. They have children, but they don't have a self anymore. I'm so afraid that I would end up with them. So across interviews, time again, we see this idea of childbearing or transitioning to childbearing as the breaking of individual self. Female respondents again and again describe parenthood as a transformative change that could upend their ideal of self. So to that end, when asked about what are their preconditions for childbearing, many mentioned that having an established career need to be the most non-negotiable precondition for childbearing. Yet their rationale has little to do with financial security, but rather by having an established career in the mind of these women, they're able to cultivate a sense of identity and self that is autonomous from the home. Yet, we see a different picture when we examine what children means among the male respondents. When I was doing interviews, I met a man, Jie, who was 32 years old and married without children. Jie worked in one of the most prestigious investment banks in China. And when I asked him about his plans of childbearing, he said he's definitely going to have a child very soon. And when I asked why, Jie became perplexed. He said, what do you mean why? I'm going to have a child. It's a thing you do. It's a thing that everybody does. So this taken for grantedness of childbearing resurfaced and again among male respondents. Similarly, Le, a 31-year-old man who's also married without children, said, when you are married and together all the time, romantic love turns to a familial bond, and with familial bond, everything feels natural. You produce a kid and bind the two people together. So in this sense, when we look at what having children means among male respondents, time and again, we see this normative belief and this buying into a normative belief that having a children, it's something you do and it's something everybody does. But the rationale is that by having a children, a couple now becomes a real family. And by having a child, a romantic couplehood turns into a family of one's own. And this idea of by having children, turning a couplehood into a real family of one's own is also deeply linked to the image of an ideal man as someone who has his own family and who's able to provide for his own family. So taken together, when we turn to the meaning of children, we see a deeply gendered ambivalence. Parenthood holds a different place in this construction of selfhood. For women, having children meant a transforming and upending of self. And it's an obligation that they feel that they are unable to opt out of. So to this end, the pursuit of individualism indeed would mean a greater desire to retreat from marriage and to retreat from parenthood. Yet for men, such ambivalence is absent. Having children is largely viewed as the natural and taken for granted next step in the life course, and childbearing is by no means in conflict with, if not facilitative, for the pursuit of individualism. Essentially, by having a child, the couplehood becomes a real family, and a real family of one's own. And by having children, the selfhood is complete. So what might explain this contrast we see? What might explain this sharp difference in the making and the breaking of selfhood? On the micro level, this contrast of make or break is rooted in the entrenched patriarchal familial norms that still view care work largely as women's work. As Li Ran, a 37-year-old mother of one daughter, said, "Men's life don't really change with children. It all falls onto the woman or the mother. Like when I take my daughter to her extracurricular activities on weekends, mostly you see other moms there with their children and one occasional dad." And this pattern is further exacerbated as we think about China's post-reform dynamics, where care work is reprivatized back into the family and it becomes women's work. But there's another part of this entrenched patriarchal familial norm. That is the norm that views childbearing not just as women's work, but also as women's duty. During my interview, I met a father, Lang, who was 37 years old and a father of one daughter. Lang was tremendously excited about the universal relaxation of the two-child policy, believing that it will fulfill his desire to have more than one child. So I asked, well, how do your wife feel about it? Lang said, when more and more people start having two children, my wife doesn't want to have two children now, but seeing the change around us when everybody's doing it, surely she will change her mind. So in other words, this deeply entrenched familial norms place childbearing both as women's care responsibilities, but also as a duty that many women feel that they are unable to opt out of. So that these family norms at the same time have come head to head with the meso-level primacy of the neoliberal market logics that view a worthy woman as a productive woman. So on the one hand, at home, women are confronted with this expectations that, childbearing is your responsibility and childcare is your work. But when they go out into the market, they are confronted with the primacy of a market-central logic that views to be a worthy individuals, it is to be a productive individual. And this is evident in women who, when they talk about their work family lives, and especially when they talk about their work. Muzi was a 28-year-old woman who was never married. Muzi worked in advertising and has a grueling schedule in this very competitive field. So much of our conversation were about how she see herself and how she see her work. And we spend a tremendous amount of time talking about the labor market conditions for women. Yet as our conversation turned to that, she doubled down and become increasingly defensive of the employers. And Muzi said, if a company hires you and you then have a child on the job, you're a loss in profit for them. They failed by hiring you. The discrimination women face at the end of the day, it's still because you're not good enough. You don't show strength. You give the impression you're all about marriage and children. Then of course you're discriminated against. So on the one hand, these women are confronting this incompatible expectations norms about what does it mean to be a worthy individual, to be an individual with moral right. At home, it came out as a message of childbearing, but in the market, it came out as this deeply market-central logic of exchange, of productivity, of being productive as the root of being responsible and being morally worthy. And at the macro level, it is also worthwhile to consider how women as individuals are imagined in the eyes of the state. Earlier, I highlighted the goals of China's population policy as governing reproduction for achieving the goals of production, and the process through which women are viewed as vehicles for achieving these demographic targets. Hualing was, at the time of the interview, 28 years old. She was married without children and coincidentally also worked in one of a prestigious financial service firm in China. And when we talked about China's turn to the universal two-child policy, we talked about how she viewed herself as the policy shifted and how she believed her family lives will change. Hualing flatly remarked, without much emotion, that the government doesn't see us as human beings, but as human resources. So again, this tension between familial norms and market-centric logics get intensified and put on full display when the state gets in the middle. And in this sense, to women, having children is viewed as the breaking of individual self, because women are not only subsumed into the family, but they are also subsumed into the state's reproductive governance. So in this sense, childbearing not only binds women to the family, it also binds women to the state. So how do we understand these patterns of make or break? And how do we understand this inherently gender link between the pursuit of individualism and the retreat or not retreat from parenthood and childbearing? For demographers interested in fertility, gender equity has increasingly become a fruitful theoretical vantage point. Yet, what does it mean to be gender egalitarian? As women navigate the unencumbered market forces on the one hand, and the renewed consonance between a pro-natalist state and a patriarchal family institutions. What choices and constraints and alliance and concessions must individuals confront and make? And in this process, how do people come to understand their selfhood and citizenship? I argue that demography provides a unique vantage point to study these questions of selfhood, rights, and citizenship, as we contend with people's decision-making and choices and constraints in one of the most intimate settings of their lives, and as we contend with how people imagine their self as they think about the reproduction, and the reproducing of selves. And these private dynamics do not happen in a vacuum, and they are shaped by both micro but also meso and macro level forces that jointly exert on this decision-making process. And as demographers, as family demography, it really provides this unique vantage point to see fertility ideations as a possible struggles for citizenship. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
You seem to be talking this in terms of change that is inconsistent with the story of second demographic transition. I I'm having trouble seeing that when you say that for one child there is consistent previously gave the example of parents having children because everybody's having children. It doesn't sound like it's just so how do you consider that?
Absolutely. So Bill's question is about my conceptualization and definition of individualism, particularly with respect to the quote from Jie, who said, "What do you mean I am having children? This is what you do. This is what everybody does." And Bill's question is, how do we square this sense of deeply normative and following the norms and go with the flow with the idea of individualism? So that's the question. Thank you so much. I think it's a great question. I think for me, as I envision individualism, what I wanted to just the way I define this concept is not necessarily that individuals. Right. So the way that I think of, or the way I conceptualize individualism as a term, I see this in close conversation with selfhood and with what individuals or what people believe are the ways in which that make them complete. So I do not see individualism as a retreat from, for example, familial relations, which is sometimes second demographic transition theorists would argue that individualism is equal or is similar to this retreat from familial relations. But rather, I define individualism as how do people understand what it means to be a whole person or to be a person that is legible. So when I was thinking through this quote or this person, for me it's important, or the way that there's a piece of legibility that is inherent to the construction of selfhood. So for men, yes, having children it's the thing that everybody does. It's a thing that they want to follow they follow this normative kind of prescribed sequence so that they become legible as a person. Now people understand their deal. They become a selfhood that is complete in that it's also legible. So I completely hear you that there is a deep sense of norms here. And in fact, I think for a lot of the male respondents that interviewed, there is close adherence to a certain sense of normative sequence. But the point that I want to highlight is that by following these norms, by following these sequences, these norms and these expectations are in no inherent conflict with how they see their ideal life, how they see their ideal self, and what kind of lives they want to lead. But rather, by following these prescriptive, normative sequence, that the self would become, a legible self becomes even more easier, becomes easier to achieve. So I think to me, in my conceptualization, individualism means a certain sense of a selfhood that is both it both feel complete to the self, but also felt legible to others. Thank you. Yes.
Paul, I also kind of struggled with the idea of individualism. I think I would have understood it. I think I would have brought the story a little easier to talk about marriage as opposed to having children. So people wanting to stay single. But I also think about these are people who have grown up in one child family.
Right.
Parents have been fighting to one child. The government policy is about. So in some ways, yeah, I kind of struggle. They're basically following government policy throughout their whole lives. And now when it's time to have children, they're allowed to have 2 children. They've kind of brought up in this environment that I don't know if I would call that individualism. I think in some ways they're saying have small families.
I see what you mean.
But you said individualism, they said, well, I don't want to be married. I want to stay single and live my own life. I would understand that having children itself is you can be very selfish motives to have children. It doesn't always do it for family reasons. You want to have children for no so that was just a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do I have to repeat for the? Oh, I guess I have to repeat Zoom. Yes, I have to repeat. Okay. So for the Zoom audience, the question is about how do we think about childbearing dynamics in relation to marriage entries, and how do we think about these people's response as are they following government expectations and policies, especially considering these are the one-child policy generations? Thank you so much for the question. I have 3 pieces of answers to it. The first piece is if we look at marriage and family patterns in China, largely childbearing still happens within the context of marriage. And there is still very little childbearing that happens outside of marriage. And marriage, to some extent, remains largely universal still in contemporary China. We see the delay in the age at first marriage, but still overall, and taking into account of the sex ratio imbalance, but overall still there remains a strong normative sense of marriage. So about government policy, I think that is exactly what is interested me when I first started on the project. I started on the piece of quantitative association where women who are gender egalitarian are more in favor of a strict birth restriction. I think to some extent, the state in the story has emerged as the lesser evil. It has emerged as a limited guardrail against the patriarchal norms, but and also against entrenched labor market logics and discriminations. So when the state shift gear and become pro-natalist, a lot of the respondents throughout my data collection process, there was a palpable mood shift. At the very beginning, when the universal two-child policy was just relaxed, some women were optimistic. They thought this meant greater choices, greater opportunities, and opportunities to have a second child should they want to. But as data collection went on, and as local government policies and rhetoric comes in that becomes pro-natalist, a lot of these women feel deeply cheated, that they felt this renewed pressure on having more than one child, and now the guardrail is off. The guardrail that they could once say, I just want to have a kid, I want to stop at one, and the government is saying one, there's nothing you can do about it. And they felt that guardrail is off. And they also felt that guardrail is off with respect to their relations with employers, that they felt that they were becoming even more discriminated, more discriminated in the labor market. So in that sense, the role of the state comes in as, a almost love-hate relationship that when it's restricting birth, it's viewed more as a friend than a foe. But then when it shifts toward a more pro-natalist approach, given these family and the market dynamics, it felt a deep sense of emotion, a deep sense, an almost emotional sense of betrayal. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. I wanted to ask about the role of sex ratios. As I understand it, with the one-child policy, there was a lot of sex-selective abortion, and there's an increase in the number of males. And I'm curious how this plays into these dynamics of family expectations, and maybe this happens with partner selection earlier on, and then that linkage to family expectations.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for the question about sex ratio. And Bill's here, and we just had a conversation about song preference this morning. So I have to preface by saying that the respondents, the respondents that I engage with for this project are highly educated urban individuals. So for the men, they typically are the ones who have college degrees and who are employed in both public sector and private sector jobs. So we know the marriage patterns in China is still profoundly hypergamous, given that for this respondent, the men in my sample do not necessarily feel like do not necessarily feel the marriage squeeze as their less educated and counterparts who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. But an interesting pattern also coming out of this data set is how women think about sex preference and how women think about whether they prefer sons and daughters. And one interesting finding, another paper that I'm working on right now, what I found is that there's still a non-negligible proportion of highly educated urban Chinese women who still exclusively prefer sons. And what is more interesting is that these women are just as gender egalitarian on other measures as their counterparts who either do not have preference or exclusively prefer daughters. And for these women, they employ deeply they employ logics for some preference that went beyond the traditional understanding of the sole devaluation of daughters. And they draw on their own lived experiences of gender inequality and frame some preference as a way in which mother must do what's best for the kid. And given how gender unequal the society is, the best for the kid is to be a boy. So I think the findings here would have implications, especially for behavioral implications, as we think about the second birth transition in contemporary China and how these women, given their sex preference, would eventually, how they think about their second birth transition. I realize the videos, the cameras there, but I'm talking there. I hope that answers some of the questions about sex preference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. And if my memory is correct, all the comments from women in this presentation is from unmarried women, married without children. And I'm wondering, for those married women already have some children, if their understanding of raising self is different. Like in Chinese culture, some women's parents usually think childbearing or parenthood is a protection to women's marriage. So in the social media, we don't know if it's true for women to raise self when they enter parenthood. So if the protection of self is the underlying truth for women, especially those who already have a child. Like, or in other words, in all the social media, women know having a child means you have to raise those with a job, or you have to raise those with isolated from others and all the other words. Of course, maybe the superficial reason of they are saying they are raising themselves to have a child, but the underlying truth, if they want to have individualism, they want to have an authentic life, they want to protect their life, they choose the childbearing as a protection.
Thank you for the question. And to repeat for our Zoom audience, the question is about how do we understand women who already have children and how they think of their selfhood and how they think of their childbearing decisions. So to answer your question, if we turn to survey data, indeed, we still see that transition to first birth is still very much taken granted as the second step after marriage. So here the question becomes, how do we understand individuals' preference? And how do we understand individuals' preference, especially they're under so many different constraints, both at the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. So the reason that I highlighted individuals who are married or who are married without children, because though they are in the midst of making that decision, they are the women who are standing at the cliff and thinking about if to jump into the abyss. And for the married respondents in my sample, there are two very distinct patterns that emerge. Indeed, a part of them talk about having children or giving birth at a time when it happened. Interesting, among the married respondents, there's very, very little use of contraception. So when I ask about the childbearing, they talk about, if now that we're married, if I get pregnant, I get pregnant. So again, this very much following this childbearing as a natural next step, and all the while recognizing that this is what is expected of them. But at the same time, I agree with you, but I think one thing to think through, especially for the married respondents, is now that they have children, how do they look back and reframe their decisions? And in a sense, how do they think through their decisions, and how do they go in retrospect look at what they were thinking when they were having children? So that was a more difficult part to tease out both the preference and constraints. And for that reason, as we think about kind of in demographic language, is the people who are at risk of having children, then that process and that time frame becomes a unique window into thinking, how do people think? How do people envision their future and their future ideal self, and what it means to lead a life, an ideal life of one's own in the future? Thank you. Yes.
And also I would like to talk about like that might be a professor research on deriving the comfort genes, such as like a pick up artist and cell as legal failure that dismisses people with as stripping away their entitlement, their selfhood, and their idealistic pursuit of self-actualization and like success in them alongside the legal inspiration. So I would like to ask to learn more about details of your interview data on the gender asymmetry, which is like or like gender antagonism, which is such a buzzword now in China. So did you observe any arguments, like disagreements between the couples, or they complain about the sex, or even like the government policy important to that, and their different senses of self conflict with each other? Are there any like anecdotes about that?
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. And the question is about basically what are the relationships between men and women in contemporary China, and are there gender asymmetry, are there gender antagonism, as we think about how do men think about whether they're entitled to wives or whether they're entitled to the sexual and reproductive labor of women. So thank you for that question. And for my interview, I intentionally did not interview couples together. So for the married individuals, they are men and women, if they are partnered, they are not in unions with each other. So I only interviewed one from each couple, basically. And one thing, and also I talked about it was Julie this morning too, is this idea in the interview protocol. I had one question about toward the very, very end when there's great rapport, and I asked, do you see, for men and women, I asked, do you feel like it's difficult to be a man in China today? Do you feel it's difficult to be a woman in China today? And men feel it's really difficult to be a man because they felt that indeed some of them at least felt that as gender egalitarianism diffuse, as women become more gender equal, there are mismatched expectations, there are mismatched aspirations. But then the question becomes within unions. Then it goes back to the question about power dynamics in marital unions. And again, broadly speaking, if we look at large-scale national data, hypergamy still remains the assorted mating patterns in China, that still hypogamous marriage is the mode of marriages. So I think it speaks to profound gender relations that are shaped or modulated by marriage entry. But I see your point about this sense of asymmetry and this sense of antagonism. And we see that across societies, and we see this sense of mismatched aspirations as well. And I think in China, it becomes more intensified to some extent as we are also confronting, as we as scholars, are also confronting how do we think about this relation in the context of sex-racial imbalance. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for our audience for asking great questions. I was really also thinking about the concept of individualism and thinking about it also
India, like the United States, and wondering how these and democracies had a hard time with this idea of individualism early on in its theorizing, and we also sometimes use the word selfishness, and I don't know how useful that is given the nature of human relationships generally. But one thing we have done a lot of is talk about the idea of gender empowerment, and I'm wondering if that idea resonated at all in your interviews. It's something that we, scholars use gender empowerment to talk about when people get married, when people have children, when we use contraception, on all this idea of family information. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that concept as opposed to individualization or selfishness or self-actualization? And I just think it's really, I think, anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
So thank you. So the question is about how do we think about, again, the concept of individualism, but vis-a-vis gender empowerment, and how do we think about whether gender empowerment captures what these women feel, and how do we think about the relations? What is really interesting to me as I was beginning this project is, for example, as we think about in other social contexts, as we think about, especially in democratic social contexts, as we think about gender employment, and in addition to gender empowerment, there's also the idea of autonomy. But oftentimes the idea of autonomy is, getting the state out of my body, getting the state out of familial decisions, getting the state out of making reproductive decisions. What was particularly interesting to me as I was engaging with the Chinese context is this idea of, I want to be a fulfilled self. I want to have my complete personhood. But the way to achieve that is through a close and sometimes twisted and unholy alliance with an autocratic state. So in other words, state becomes the way in which that offers some measure of protections. So in this context, it's the woman who profess gender egalitarianism, it's the woman who believe in women's equal rights and roles, who show a stronger support for the state's stronger hand in trying to control birth. So I thought that was really what interested me about this context in comparison to other contexts, is in a non-democracy, in a non-democratic context, how do women see their empowerment, and how do they see are the possible views and ways in which this empowerment can be achieved? And it seems that it's through a deeply close alliance with an autocratic state. I think that was what also made me think about what do we mean when we talk about gender empowerment, and who empowers, and what are we talking about when we're talking about gender egalitarianism the sort of the power relations are deeply shaped by political structure. So that's some of the thoughts that I have right now, but I would love to think more deeply and talk more about, how do these people see their selfhood, and how do these people see their selfhood in relation to the other social institutions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.